When we bite into a delicious pot sticker, the first thing we might focus on is how good the filling tastes. But if you've ever made pot stickers from scratch, you know how important the wrapper actually is. And it's not just about texture. I believe the wrapper should taste good by itself. It should be soft when steamed, crispy when fried, and there's one extra step that we can take to make it taste spectacular. Hey, Seraphin here, and today we're making pot stickers. In China, these kinds of dumplings are called Guotie, and in Japan, they go under the name Gyoza. There might be regional variations between recipes, but the essence is that there's a wrapper that we stuff with fillings and then we cook and pan fry the pot sticker on at least one side. Now, good pot stickers aren't just made of good fillings. I found that they also require a soft and tender wrapper that cooks quickly and gives us a crispy bottom. The wrapper also has to basically taste good by itself, and while convenient, store-bought wrappers can be kind of bland. Now, there are two things that make these homemade wrappers properly stand out. The first is that we use a blend of oils, sesame oil and vegetable oil infused with garlic and chives. This is really a game changer in how good it makes the dumplings taste. I feel like you can smell how delicious the wrapper is before you even fill and cook it. It's even better if you can get some rich sesame oil. These oils lend so much flavor to the wrappers, and they also help tenderize it, giving it an even softer texture, something that is also aided by the second thing that makes these wrappers stand out. To give these wrappers the perfect texture, we're using a very traditional method. I'm talking about the Tàng method of adding hot water in gradual amounts to all of the flour. Then you mix and knead everything together until it turns into a smooth dough. This method of making dumpling wrappers originated from China. 烫面 in Chinese literally means to scald the flour. Many gyoza makers in Japan also use this method, which makes sense because gyoza historically originated from China. It's a bit interesting to notice that the Japanese kanji for gyoza comes from the words for dumplings in Chinese, read 饺子. But it's not the same kind of dumpling. Like we said earlier, Japanese gyoza are actually a form of guotie. But anyways, does the 烫面 method actually make good pot sticker wrappers? Well, the short answer is yes, and there's a good explanation behind it. If you make the wrappers with the 烫面 method, not only do you get a smoother and softer dough, you'll also find that it's so much easier to stretch and that it makes for incredibly soft pot stickers with a crispy bottom. This method is pretty different from the 汤种 or udane method for soft bread. And in fact, as I've mentioned before in my previous video, you don't want to use the 汤种 or udane method to replace 汤面 or vice versa. These two methods are not interchangeable. I think that part of the confusion stems from the fact that many of the explanations I've seen about the 烫面 method focus on the gelatinization of starch. But just looking at the amount of water used for 烫面, that is definitely not the whole picture. You see, the 汤种 or udane method calls for a large amount of boiling hot water, at minimum a 1-to-1 ratio of flour to water. On the other hand, the 烫面 method calls for much less water, as well as adding it in gradual amounts. Technically, for starch gelatinization to happen, the flour needs to be in excess water, which is not the case with 汤面. This means that the 汤种 or udane method results in a lot more starch gelatinization compared to the 烫面 method. Visually, you can see that the 汤种 or udane is an almost gel-like mixture, while dough made using the 汤面 method is more cohesive. If it were just about starch gelatinization, it would be much more effective to make 汤种 and then add this into dumpling wrappers. But if we focus on starch gelatinization alone, we miss out on another potentially more important component, the gluten. Gluten is what makes wheat dough so bouncy and elastic in the first place. Adding hot water, though, can change that. Enough heat and water result in the denaturation of gluten proteins. They don't work like they're supposed to. This ultimately weakens the gluten network, which is actually a good thing here. Remember, gluten is what makes the dough elastic and bouncy. In other words, it gives you that resistance when you pull it. Now that it's weaker, we can extend the dough a lot more easily, stretching it out however we like and rolling it out very thin. Additionally, more gluten tends to make wheat products harder, which is a quality we absolutely don't want in our pot stickers. With all these benefits of weakening the gluten network being said, we still want some of it in our dough. That's why we make sure to add the hot water in small amounts, gradually mixing it into all the flour. We also need to let the dough rest a bit more in between mixing because this dough is particularly prone to over mixing. Okay, now that we're done with all of that, let's put it into practice and get started with the recipe. So these are the pot stickers we're going to be making, and this recipe makes about 26 pot stickers, which is an amount that I feel makes for a pretty satisfying meal for one. In this video though, I am making double the recipe just to properly demonstrate everything, and it's also for convenience since I can store some of the pot stickers in the freezer to keep for later. I highly recommend making larger batches of the recipe because while it isn't very complicated or difficult, it is much more convenient to make a big batch and store it for whenever you want to eat it. The oils in this recipe are quite important, so I do recommend a good sesame oil with plenty of flavor. The richer, the better. As for the infused oil, make sure to use an unflavored vegetable oil to infuse with the garlic and chives. Aside from putting this infused oil in the dough, I also add it to the filling, and it's also really easy to use in sauces. Additionally, the crispy fried garlic is a fantastic topping for the dumplings and pretty much anything else, so make sure to save it. The filling of this recipe uses pork meat and napa cabbage. I should note that the napa cabbage definitely gives these pot stickers a bit of a sharp, grassy note. I really like that flavor, but if you'd prefer a more neutral flavor, you could either quickly blanch the shredded cabbage or pan fry it with a bit of oil for a few minutes. As for the sauces for flavor and to marinate the meat, we're adding white pepper, soy sauce, oyster sauce, and grated ginger. It's best if you can let the meat marinate in this mixture for a few hours before you add the napa cabbage because it'll make the filling much softer and more flavorful. Okay, so let's get started. The first thing we need to make is our infused oil. So first things first, I'm chopping up all of the garlic. You could use a food processor for this if you'd like. We just want to make sure to chop it pretty finely. And the garlic oil I'm making is quite concentrated, which is why there's so much garlic. If you'd prefer a less garlicky flavor in your pot stickers, you could of course use less, so make sure to adjust this to your personal preference. It's best to make this garlic oil a bit in advance so that the garlic can really infuse into the oil. Once all the garlic is chopped, we're going to move it into the same small bowl that we had it in just now. And just before we fry this garlic, we're going to chop our chives. If you'd prefer a stronger chive flavor, you could of course add more chives to this oil. I like to just cut the chives in half like this, and then realign them and chop them up. They don't need to be extremely fine. In fact, it's better to keep them a little chunky. So just chop them roughly, and it shouldn't take too long. Okay, we then place the chopped chives into another small bowl, and now we're going to heat the garlic and the oil up first before pouring them over the chives. Alright, in a small pan, we're going to pour in our vegetable oil. Any neutral vegetable oil will do. Regular cooking oil is okay too. Then we turn on the heat. We let the oil heat up for about a minute or two, and then add in our chopped garlic, getting all of it in. The oil should be hot enough that it sizzles on contact, otherwise the garlic might stick to the bottom. Now we want to let this go on a medium-high fire, stirring it occasionally. Our goal is to get the garlic to a golden brown color, and for that to happen, the temperature should reach a temperature closer to 140 degrees Celsius, because that is where the optimal temperature range for the Maillard reaction begins. Along with some caramelization, the Maillard reaction is the cause of that browning and delicious flavor. So we need to get it hot enough for the reaction to happen. It'll take some time for the garlic and oil to heat up, likely because we added so much garlic to this oil, and more than half of the garlic is water, so there's going to be quite a bit of sizzling. Just stay patient and continue stirring. This smells so fragrant already. The scent of garlic is really filling up the kitchen. Okay, when the color looks like this, still a bit light, but it's already showing signs of turning brown, we're gonna turn off the heat and pour it into the bowl with chives in it. Be very careful, this is hot oil after all. And we are done making our infused oil. I normally just set this aside and let it infuse for a while before I strain it to use in the pot stickers. It doesn't look like a lot of oil, but it's enough for us to use. All right, now we move on to the next step, which is preparing the dough. So I have a kettle with some boiling hot water, and now we're gonna pour some of it into the flour, mixing it right after with a wooden rolling pin. We repeat that for the rest of the water. Add in the water directly from the kettle and at a faster rate to prevent it from cooling down. It's a bit of a balancing act because if you add too little hot water, the pot sticker wrappers could turn out too dry and strong and take a longer time to cook. But if you add too much water, they could be too soft and the dough would be very sticky as well as difficult to shape. This is something that may require a bit of experimentation. Then after adding all of the water, we're gonna add in the sesame oil and infused oil, throwing both of them into the still warm dough. These oils will help to further soften the dough and make it more extensible. We mix it a little more, and then we're gonna knead the dough. Of course, be careful here. If it's too hot, you can give it a few minutes to cool down before continuing to knead it. We want to knead for just about 5 minutes until the dough becomes homogeneous and a little smooth. It will and should be, however, slightly rough to handle. It should not be a perfectly smooth one like you'd see for bread dough. At least not now. That would mean that there's a lot of gluten development, which is not what we want. As we keep kneading it, it should get just a bit more cohesive, and when it looks like this, that's when we're done. It's still breaking a bit here and there. That's okay. We don't want to continue now because this dough will get worse if we continue to knead it. So we're going to stop here and cover the dough with the bowl. We're going to give it a 20-minute break just to really relax before we come back to it. After 20 minutes, we're going to uncover the dough. It's actually still warm to the touch here, and I'm just going to knead it for about a minute. When it looks this smooth, we're good. The dough is done, so we're gonna cover it again and set it aside to relax while we work on our filling. For the filling, the first thing we're gonna do is grate our ginger, trying to get it nice and fine. I'll measure it with a scale to get the amount we need. And when we're done, we're gonna make our meat mixture. So we have all of our ingredients prepared here, mise en place. In a large mixing bowl, we have our minced pork. To it, we're adding in our infused oil, letting it drip in. Then the soy sauce, throwing it in. And then we add in our grated ginger, followed by the delicious sesame oil. After that, oyster sauce. I need a spatula to get it all in. It's pretty sticky. Finally, we toss in the white pepper. After that, we're gonna mix everything together, making sure to really mash the soy sauce into the meat. You wanna make sure that the sauces are well spread throughout the meat so that no part is saltier than the other. Then we're gonna cover the bowl and let this marinate for at least 45 minutes. It's better if you can do it for longer because the meat will become even softer and juicier. Around 10 minutes before the meat is done with its marinade, we're going to prepare the napa cabbage. Now, you could use a food processor to chop it up, but I find that doing it by hand gives it a rougher texture that adds a nice and soft crunch to the pot stickers, which is why I do prefer to do it by hand. I normally split the cabbage in smaller chunks first, taking a few leaves at a time, dividing it into smaller portions. Then I cut the cabbage into thin strips like this, just working my way along the leaves. You want to focus on properly breaking up the stem of the cabbage. That needs to be really well chopped, otherwise it can really affect the texture. But for the leaves, you don't need to make them as fine because they'll wilt and soften a lot more than the stem. We want to keep going like this. You'll probably want a nice and heavy knife for this. That'll help you get this kind of rhythmic movement. Again, it doesn't need to be too fine, so when it looks like this, we're good. We're going to move this to a glass mixing bowl before continuing to chop the rest of the cabbage. 100%, I think the sound of chopping this cabbage is fantastic. It just sounds so crunchy and fresh. And although some people prefer fillings with just meat, I've honestly found that without any veggies, a meat-only pot sticker can be kind of hard in texture. It's just so much softer and juicier with some veggies. Additionally, I do like the idea that it makes the pot stickers a little healthier with the addition of some greens, right? Okay, now that we've chopped all the cabbage and put it into this bowl, we're going to add in some salt. And then we want to really mix that salt into the cabbage, using our hands to sort of squeeze and rummage the cabbage, really getting in there, making sure the salt coats the cabbage well. The reason we do this is to draw the water out of the cabbage, and salt is really good at this because it exerts osmotic pressure, and that pulls out the water. Look at how much water is coming out already, and it hasn't even been 5 minutes. When the salt has been mixed into all the cabbage, you're going to set this aside and leave it for about 10 minutes. While we do want to draw out some of the water in the cabbage, it's important that we don't overdo it and end up with something that's too dry. Some water is good for the filling and it helps to soften it. So after 10 minutes, we can strain the cabbage. I have another bowl with a strainer set over it, and I'm going to move the cabbage over into the strainer. Then we'll squeeze out the water with our hands. Look at how much water is coming out. You can see by the size of the cabbage compared to just now, it's shrunk by a lot, and that is mostly water weight. The texture has also become a lot softer, less crunchy, and more malleable. Once we've gotten most of the water out, we're going to quickly rinse the cabbage to get rid of some of the salt. Then we're going to set it aside for a moment and chop up our chives for the filling. We want to chop them pretty thinly here so that there aren't any large chunks in the pot stickers. Just moving my way down. And when we're done with them, we're going to move them all into the strainer with the cabbage. Finally, all of that goes into the meat. And we mix everything together immediately after. There's no technique to this. I'm just trying to make it all homogeneous. Okay, that looks good enough. Now we're going to set this aside and make our wrappers. Last step before filling. Here is our dough, and I've got some cornstarch on the side. We're first going to roll our dough out into a nice and long log. This is the most effective way to divide the dough into the numerous dumpling wrappers we're making. It's double the recipe, so 2 times 26, 52 dumpling wrappers. You shouldn't need to apply too much force to stretch the dough, by the way, just some light pressure. And I'm also going to divide the dough into 2, make it easier to work with. Then we're going to start cutting the dough up using a scraper. We are aiming for pieces that weigh 8 grams, of course adjusting for variations in thickness. I'm also using a scale to weigh the pieces, just a quick double check. Make sure there's no piece that's much heavier or lighter than the other. And I'll just keep going. There are a lot of pieces here, so I'm not aiming for every single one to be perfectly 8 grams. As long as it's around 8 grams, like 7 or 9, that's okay. We're just trying to get through all of these pieces as quickly as possible. We're also using a bit of cornstarch to dust the dough balls. Don't use too much here, otherwise you might have issues shaping the pot stickers later. I'm using a little more here because it's so humid and I'm worried the dough will stick. Okay, once this part of the dough has been cut and weighed, we're going to essentially pre-shape them into little round balls. And I'm just moving fast here, pulling in the edges and sealing them before rolling the dough in my palms. It doesn't need to be perfectly circular, just round enough. This is a lot of dumplings, so it took me like 20 minutes to get it all done. When they're all done, we move on to the next step, which is rolling the dough out. We're going to first press the dough down with our hands before rolling it out into a thinner disc. Now the edges should ideally be much thinner than the center of the dumpling because we're going to be folding the wrapper. So with our rolling pin, we're going to roll out just the edges of the piece of dough. Ideally, this should give us a really round wrapper. This technique does require some practice though, and another way you can get the same effect is just by using the rolling pin ordinarily, rolling the wrapper from the center out, getting it nice and thin. You can choose whichever way you'd prefer to make the wrappers. When you stack the wrappers up, it's important to use an adequate amount of cornstarch in between layers to prevent them from sticking together. Okay, and we just repeat these steps for the rest of the dough pieces. Now that we have a nice and thick stack of wrappers, let's finally get to the fun part, making the actual pot stickers. So we'll grab one wrapper, and to fill it, I'm actually using a fork, which I found to be the most convenient way to get the filling in. After the filling is in, I'm going to fold in the center, and then make 3 more folds like this on each side, so left and right. Naturally, this is just one way of folding the pot stickers. You can fold them any way you like. I'm going to repeat the step for the rest of the pot stickers. If the wrappers are too dry, you can use a bit of water to line the edges so that you can seal them properly. You could also just press the fillings up a bit to seal the wrappers like this. Although if the dough has been made right, it shouldn't be very difficult to seal the pot stickers. When we're done with all of them, let's move to the stove. In a large pan, I'm going to pour in some cooking oil, let that heat up, and then we'll add our pot stickers in. We're first just going to let them fry for about a minute or 2, letting the bottom get a little brown, not too much. And then since I wanted the pot stickers to have some delicious skirts or wings, I'm adding in a slurry of wheat flour, cornstarch, and water. We want to fill the pan up with water until it's roughly around the halfway point of the pot stickers. Then we'll cover them and let them cook for about 7 to 8 minutes on a medium-high heat or until the water is about to run out. I usually use about 1.5 tablespoons of all-purpose flour and a teaspoon of cornstarch for 250 milliliters of water as the slurry. I found that this gives a really nice honeycomb-like wing when made right. I've tried cornstarch alone in the slurry, but it tends to give a much more even crumb structure when compared to a slurry with all-purpose flour. But cornstarch does make the wings much crispier, so with this combination, I aimed for wings that are both crispy and good-looking. You could of course skip adding this slurry if you don't want those extra wings and just add water. The use of wings is more commonly associated with gyoza, and to get them to detach off the pan easily later, make sure you add enough oil when lining the pan earlier. This boiling and steaming part of the cooking process is partially a continuation of our previous step of adding hot water to the flour. Here we fully gelatinize the starches and denature the gluten, leading to a tender and soft product. If we've made the wrapper right, then these should be super soft and pretty quick to cook. We can see it happening in front of our eyes. The top of the wrapper should turn a nice pale shade with a shiny sheen to it. If your wrappers were a bit too dry and strong though, you may need to cook them for longer. No worries though. Now I used a clear lid to cover these pot stickers so I can see when the water is about to run out, but you could also tell by the sound. When the water is about to run out like here, we're going to open up the lid and let the water dry up. This is when the pot stickers begin to fry again, this time along with their wings. Eventually the wings should detach effortlessly from the pan, lifting up like this. When it turns brown enough, indicating plentiful flavor from the Maillard reaction, we're going to scoop out the pot stickers gently, trying to avoid destroying too much of the wings. And then we are done. We still have a lot more dumplings left, but these are so good and best eaten warm. They're both super crunchy on the bottom and extremely soft on the top. It's fantastic. No one can stop eating after just one. The filling is so juicy and rich. It's full of that umami thanks to the soy sauce and oyster sauce. When we're not concerned about making aesthetically pleasing pot stickers, we can also fill the pan up with as many pot stickers as we can. It looks like this, a bit of a mess. Some of the pot stickers are sticking together, but it doesn't affect the flavor or the rate at which these pot stickers disappear. And that's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and bye!